Alright, back again. Where were we? Oh, yeah. See, moving on to the rest of the passage, I kind of got sidetracked by that a little bit there, but it is certainly fascinating. Of course, we can continue to the next part down here. The president shall receive at stated times. Shall at stated times receive for his services a compensation which shall be neither increased nor diminished during the period for which he shall have been elected. And he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them. In other words, he cannot receive any kind of monetary compensation from either the United States government or any of the several states at the same time that he's receiving a salary, and cannot, increase, have an increase or a reduction of his pay that takes effect during his term of office. It would wait until the next term of office before it would take effect if it was passed during his administration. Which kind of makes you wonder about the president's pay increase that happened recently. The one he gave himself, kind of thing. That's kind of questionable on several grounds. See, not that Obama has ever allowed anything like the Constitution to stand in his way for anything. Which brings me to the next part. Before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, people will wonder, if they haven't seen that before, where are the words, so help me God? Well, that's not actually in the text. That's a kind of an invocation or a prayer that George Washington made at the time of his first inauguration, and every president has traditionally made it ever since. But it's not technically required. It's not in the actual language of the text or part of the actual oath. It's more of a prayer. Or an invocation that George Washington made. And yes, believe it or not, George Washington did pray on occasion. Believe it or not. Hard to mention, huh? You have a lot of people that say that George Washington didn't ever pray, which would be news to George Washington. But that's another issue. Let me see. Read the next part. Oh, yes. The relevant part that I was really wanting to get to. Section 2, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. The President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. He may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer of each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices, and shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So, he can't, grant, reprieve or pardon from an actual impeachment. That's outside of his jurisdiction. That's the proper jurisdiction of the House and Senate. The House to impeach, the Senate to convict or acquit, as they see fit. Which, of course, the Senate has never convicted anyone in that context. As far as the presidency is concerned, they've never convicted a president who's been impeached and thrown him out of office. They both times acquitted. Cases of the impeachments of Andrew Johnson and, of course, more recently, Bill Clinton. Let's see. What's next? He shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present to concur, and he shall nominate, and by and with the advice of and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper to the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. In other words, Congress in these other cases may direct the manner in which these officers are appointed. It may say by law, for example, that the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of the Treasury or the Treasurer of the United States or something can be appointed in a certain fashion. Okay. Whether by the President of the United States alone or by some other means. There are certain officers, key officers, whose appointment, however, require the advice and consent of the Senate. Now we get to another tricky part, because this area has been kind of abused by the current administration. The President shall have power to fill up all vacancies which may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. Now here's where it gets tricky, because the Senate in recent cases has met in pro forma session. That is to say, they have met more or less for the sake of saying that they met. They've met, but they haven't really done much. But in those cases where they're not meeting in pro forma session, there's been a quite understandable argument that they were not in recess, because they were at least in pro forma session. And therefore, having been in pro forma session, that is to say, for the sake of form, it's from Latin pro forma, basically for the form, for the ritual, for the ceremonial purpose, as it were. Because the Senate did meet in pro forma session in those cases, it's been argued that therefore it's by obvious logic not in recess, and therefore the President could not make recess appointments for those offices. Of course, this President loves nothing more or less than to appoint as much as possible, as much as he can get away with people to certain offices without any checks or balances or anything like that. Consider how many czars he's appointed. I think we have more czars than Russia ever did. Which is funny, because I don't recall there being any provision for a czar anywhere in the Constitution. But that's another issue. Didn't think we were supposed to have czars. The word czar is a Russian word, it basically means Caesar. In the context, it means emperor, and how many emperors can one country have anyway? Let me see. What's the next part? He shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the state of the Union, and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall seem judge necessary and expedient. He may, on extraordinary occasions, convene both houses or either of them, and in any case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of adjournment, he may adjourn them to such time as he shall think proper. He shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and shall commission all the officers of the United States. Okay. So, one of the functions that is often turned into a sort of political circus here in this country these days is the State of the Union address. As you can see, the technical language does not require an actual convention of the houses to be, joint session, as it were, meeting with the president, giving direct address to them in person. That's actually a relatively recent practice. There were several presidents, basically for roughly a century, more than a century, that did not do this. No president from Thomas Jefferson until, if I remember correctly, Woodrow Wilson did that at all. So every president from Thomas Jefferson through William Howard Taft gave written information to the Congress, the State of the Union, made their recommendations and so forth, but did not actually appear in Congress before any kind of joint session, did not actually give an in-person speech or address referring to the State of the Union. That was Woodrow Wilson's own personal thing, that he was reviving a practice originally done by John Adams and by George Washington. So you had George Washington and John Adams who did this, and then no president at all until Woodrow Wilson, and then he started doing that, and then again, of course, it started happening consistently. Every president since then has done that every year, at least once a year, an annual State of the Union address. But it is not actually technically required by the Constitution. President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for or in conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors. And so some people have questioned what the word misdemeanor means. There's no question, presumably, what a high crime would refer to, which of course would be a felony. If you know anything about the infamous case of William Jefferson Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States, President Clinton was charged with perjury and obstruction of justice, if I remember correctly. Both of which, of course, federal offenses. Quite arguably, in both cases could be construed to be high crimes, and therefore he was impeached, although not convicted. If he had been convicted, of course, then Al Gore, as the vice president at the time, would have immediately taken office as president of the United States. Okay. As you can see, there's no point at which the president has been given the power to engage in drone strikes against U.S. citizens. No time which the president has been engaged and has been empowered to launch any kind of offensive military operations without a declaration of war or anything of that sort. The president is not, just because he's the commander-in-chief, authorized to just use the armed forces or whatever he sees fit. There are powers that the Congress have which are meant to check the power that he has commander-in-chief. Powers basically determining things like declaration of war and things of that nature. Here's another important provision. But anyway, that was why, like I said, why I disagreed with those in the survey who supposedly corrected me and said that I was wrong, that why I did not agree, have agreed with the president that he was still constitutionally correct. Of course, you can see from what I've read although I recommend that you read it yourself, of course, the Constitution, that the president does not have any such power as what happened when he exercised in Libya. Significant, by the way, of course, that this president ran as a peace candidate, and he's been busy getting us into yet another war. And presumably, if he could get away with it, would get us involved in yet another war after that. So much for bringing the troops home. So much for being a candidate for peace or being anti-war. Now, personally, I've always supported the troops. I don't support necessarily the wars in which they're sent. But this president, a man who will gladly use military power, or gladly extend our reach, as it were, militarily, but then has very little use for the actual soldiers themselves, and shows complete contempt and disdain for the military and for those within the military who are supposed to be, under his command, who have fought for this country. Anyway, let me read next another key provision here. In all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, and those in which the state shall be a party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. Now that's a rather interesting passage, because what that basically does is to empower Congress to place some limits on the exercise of judicial review. Limit, what areas or what exceptions and so forth can be applied to judicial review. One obvious case for that would be probably abortion, for example. There's a lot of people who now argue that the Supreme Court should not have the power to decide such things, and that each state should once more determine what is to be done about that. Roe v. Wade, of course, was a piece of rather questionable judicial opinion, and a lot of people have chosen to suggest that we would simply make an exception for abortion or regulate the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court where abortion is concerned. I think that's enough for one night. I've been reading for 18 minutes. All right. See you later.